Here's a young, tall American. 1966 in Dotting District. And you notice there are very few girls. They were the daughters of probably the Newar shopkeepers, and most of the kids aren't wearing shoes. And some of the third graders weren't even wearing anything below the waist. All right. But I don't want to talk about my Peace Corps experience.
All right.
But I came in '66. I taught English in Dotting and Bunipa. The Dotting School, again, I don't want to go into all that story why I transferred. Then, 1969, had I come back to America, Uncle Sam would have captured me and sent me to Vietnam. So I went to St. Xavier's and I said, can you use a teacher at a Nepali salary of like 400 rupees a month? So I taught 1 year at St. Xavier's. And Father John Locke was the principal. He's written several books on the Newars. He's a very scholarly man. And I taught some of the students I'm still in touch with, like Connick Dixon. He was a student of mine. Jyoti Manserchand, who's the head of Malpi School. So when I go back, I still am in touch with some of my students who are now 60, 65 years old. So then I did my PhD dissertation research from 73 to 75. So I went back to Nepal and I studied the Rana administration system. Then after I retired from the U.S. government in 2009, I've gone back to Nepal every year except 2020, which was a COVID year. And I took my daughter Lingi to Tibet in 2018. We went to Tibet,
you went?
to Lhasa and Shigatse and so on. But I'm never going to go to China again. I went to Beijing with the U.S. government, and anyway. So I've written 4 books on Nepal, and these are my daughter's copies. This was Nepal in color. This was published in Kathmandu, and these these are photos I took from '66 to '75.
Nice.
I have that book. You gave it to me.
You bought it from me.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So
So did we.
I have copies in Denver. I don't have any copies actually here. Then I did a book called Nepal in Black and White. This was a couple years ago. And these were colored. These were photos of Nepal. If I have time, I'll talk a little bit more about this. But my great love was railways in Nepal. A, nobody's ever written about it, and B, because I like railways. I grew up liking railways. I spent 8 years every time I go to Nepal. I go to the National Archives, I interview people. So that book is available on Amazon. I'm going to add some more material to it. It's 325 pages. It has 400 illustrations. Of course, in Nepal, who cares, right? I realize that. I don't write books to make money. But I've donated copies to the libraries there. And then I did this book on the trolley bus. Chinese government built a trolley bus went from Tripodishwar to Bhaktapur in 1975. And it was green energy back then.
Yeah.
But
They took it out, right?
the sad story is here. It was abandoned really in about 2002. And the story, mismanagement, lack of spare parts, et cetera, et cetera.
Repairing, maintaining.
All right, so today though, now I want to talk about this book.
Next slide.
And what is that railway? You were talking about the railway.
Yeah, I don't have a copy. That's on Amazon, but if you want a copy, and it's fairly expensive because, and I don't have a copy. All right, the story of this book is about 25 years ago, the National Archives is out in College Park. And I went out there and I said, what do you have about Nepal? And they brought out 3 or 4 boxes of records. One box they couldn't find. Now, since I don't live here in this area, I haven't gone back to see if I could get that box. But anyway, and I didn't have a digital camera, I didn't have a scanner, so I photocopied a lot of these documents. And so I've had a stack of documents like this in my place in Denver and here when I was here. And last year I said, well, I should do something with these documents. So this is called America Meets Nepal, 1944 to 52. Here's a picture taken in 1948 by an American from Dadara, from the tower. And you see that here's Swayambhu here, and New Road here, and so on. And this was the main part of Kathmandu.
This picture is from 1948.
1948. Now,
Sorry.
what I think is interesting about this book is it is based upon U.S. State Department records. the U.S. State Department, you know, they were in Delhi, and the Delhi ambassador, first they were reading the Indian newspapers. Now, of course, we all know that what you can read in the newspapers is not necessarily true, but still, there was that record. Secondly, they were talking, the ambassador in India was talking with Nehru's advisors and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And thirdly, there were 3 missions that came up from Delhi to Kathmandu during the Rana times. And those people kept records of their conversations and what they saw in Nepal. Again, so 44 to 52. So what I think is interesting is the British records, presumably, you know, they had an embassy here and they had a high commissioner in Delhi. So those records are probably available in London, but I've never seen anything written about them. The Indian records, I'm convinced, have never been made public. You know, Nehru's speeches, Nehru's letters, I mean, those are available. But when Nehru met, you know, Mohan Shamsher and King Trublin, are records of those meetings available? I doubt it. I mean, they may be available in Delhi, but I doubt the Indian government has declassified them. And now in Nepal too, I know in the archives. And I don't know, those records, either they don't exist or they've not been made public. I don't know, you know, after the Rana regime fell, whether those records were kept in the palace and what happened to them, or whether the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has them. So most of the books in Nepali about this time were based on oral history. You know, B.P. Corral wrote a book. So they're remembering what went on. But as far as documents, they're very few. So this is a very limited view of an American perspective of what they learned about Nepal. As I say, they didn't have an embassy until 1959. But still, there's information in here, you know, that's never been published before. All right, so so now, if you don't mind, I'm going to sit down. I wrote a script before I went to Nepal. I gave this program in Nepal a couple of times, and I don't have a photographic memory, and so anyway. All right, so the first chapter was based on my research, and I was, you know, the British have been in Nepal for more than 200 years, but very, very few Americans went to Nepal, and as far as I know, this is the first man that went to Nepal in 1885. And he was working for the State Department in Bombay, Henry Ballantyne, and he and his 13-year-old son were invited by the British resident to visit Kathmandu. And they went up and reached it in November 1885, and he met the Prime Minister at that time, who was Ranadip Singh. And 1 week later, Ranadip Singh was assassinated by the Shamsher Rana nephews. So this man writes about meeting Ranadip Singh. As far as I know, he's the only American that went to Nepal in the 19th century. Now, somebody else might have, but I found no record of them. All right, this is Frank Buck, and he was from Texas, and he was a world-famous catcher of wild animals. And he wrote a book in 1930 called Bring 'Em Back Alive. And in 1923, he bought 2 Indian rhino calves from the Terai. And he took them to the Philadelphia and the Bronx zoos. Now, he actually didn't go into the Terai and capture them, but he met Kesar Shamsher, you know, who was the son of Chandra Shamsher. And Kesar Shamsher had 20 elephants and more than 100 Nepalis, probably Tarus, go into the jungles in the Terai, and they captured 2 rhinos, weighing each about a ton, 2,000 pounds. So Buck then went into the Terai, and he brought these rhinos to Roxall, India, and then they went by train to Calcutta, and from Calcutta they went by ship all the way around to San Francisco, and then from there to New York and Philadelphia. And so this man, and he said that was one of his greatest adventures. You know,
What year was it?
This was 1923, and he paid Chandra Shamsher 35,000 rupees for those two rhinos.
At that time.
At that time. Next. All right, this man. Now this book, these are available on Amazon in reprints. He was a war correspondent and a world traveler, and I call him the first ugly American. Have any of you read the book, The Ugly American? All right. Now, he was in Calcutta in 1928, and he managed to meet Chandra Shamsher, who was Prime Minister, and he got permission to go to Nepal. And his book, though, contained extremely critical passages about Hinduism and its naked holy men, and Buddhist lamas who had bad body odor and needed to bathe. Now, he did praise the strength of the Nepali coolies, you know, that carried his loads. But he said, really, there's no place, Nepal is not worth visiting. And so I'm sure the Ranas, when they read this book, were sad that they ever let him in the country. All right, next. Now this man, is completely unknown. I sort of discovered him. He was a doctor from Youngstown, Ohio. His name is Dr. Charles Blanchard. And he and his wife were the first Americans that I know of that were actually invited into Nepal by the government. Now he was a proctologist. Does anybody know what a proctologist is? Well, the Americans know. Hemorrhoids, colon cancer, rectal problems, right? Now, and he'd been lecturing in London and so on. So somehow the Nepalis heard of him, and they invited him to come to Kathmandu in February 1929. And he wrote a long article in a magazine that I got a copy of in the Library of Congress. And he described Chandra Shamsher, quote, as a dictator with velvet gloves, a composite mixture of intellect, shrewdness, justice, kindness, and sternness. He had a charming smile, and he's loved and at the same time feared by his subjects. Now, it is said in Nepal that Chandra Shamsher died of TB, but I think maybe he had colon cancer or was suffering from colon cancer, because otherwise, why would he have called this this man to come and treat him? Of course, unfortunately, this man's notes, he never said, of course, doctor-patient confidentiality of why he treated Chandra Shamsher. But after that, he conducted classes at Beer Hospital. And at that time, the doctors at Beer Hospital were all Bengali doctors, because there was no Nepali that it was an MD in 1929. All right, next. Now, this appeared in an American newspaper in 1935. Now, you see, the Americans, they weren't sure, is Nepal part of India, or is it a separate country? The point here is that the Rana palaces from the outside looked like European palaces, like you'd see in France or Britain. But inside, they wanted the latest American furniture. So what happened was Judha Shamsher, who was Maharaja, and other of the Ranas, they wrote to Montgomery Wards in Chicago, and they said, can you design a room in our palace that will have American sofas and chairs and lamps and so on? And so this was a drawing of what Montgomery Ward did, and then they sent the equipment, the sofas and so on, all the way to Nepal, to Calcutta, and from Calcutta they went by rail to Roxall, and then by rail to Amlagunj, and then by truck to Dursing, and then by ropeway to Kathmandu. And so, it was easier for American furniture to get into Nepal in 1930 than for American citizens to get into Nepal.
You said Montgomery Ward?
Yeah, Montgomery Ward in Chicago.
Oh my God.
They furnished the Rock palaces with furniture.
They don't have any more.
All right, so that takes us to World War II, right? So as far as I know, there were only a handful of Americans that ever got to Nepal in the 1920s. There were a couple of hunters that are in the book that I didn't talk about that went tiger shooting and so on in the Tarai. Now, World War II, the Americans had an office in India because they were sending materials, war materials, to India, because the Allies were fighting the Japanese in Burma and in Southeast Asia. And so in 1945, the Nepali official wrote to the Americans in India saying, maybe we have some strategic minerals that would be of use, in manufacturing weapons, tanks, and so on. Just like for your cell phone, you need lithium. So they needed certain minerals, and so Nepal thought maybe we can sell to the Americans some minerals to use in the war. So this man, his name is Andrew Corey, and he had studied. He was a geologist. He got a degree from Montana. Now, the only thing I'd request is that you not put these on the internet. All right, these photos. I'll tell you why later, because a lot of these are not my photos, right? So anyway, you're welcome to take photos. Okay, so anyway, so he went up. Now, he was a junior level guy, right? Probably 25, 30 years old. And he went up to Nepal in 1944. And he was invited, to check the mineral samples. Beryl was one mineral that's used in manufacture of radio receivers and so on. So he went up, and he was only a junior civil servant, but he had an audience with Prime Minister Judha Shamsher. Okay, so now that's a very common picture. So again, this American who was mid-level, not a VIP, not an ambassador, nobody, but he went up and he interviewed British, or he talked with them, and he took notes of what Julius Rumsher was telling him and the other Ranas. And he wrote a report and sent these to Delhi, and they sent them to Washington. And I found them, you know, in the National Archives, and I made copies of what they said. So excerpts of their reports are in this book. All right, next. All right, now this man is Kartika Narsingh Rana, and he had gotten a degree in chemistry from Bombay, and he was appointed as director of the Bureau of Mines in Nepal in 1941. And he was the one that was writing to the Americans because he was in charge, you know, of the mines. Now, his son lives in Maharajganj, and I've gone to meet his son. His son got one of these books.
Whose father?
This is Kartika Narsingh Rana, and his son is still Unil.
His father. Who is he?
That I don't off the top of my head know, but he's a Narsingh Rana. He's not a Shamshar.
Oh, Narsingh Rana.
He's a Narsingh Rana, but he was educated. You know, he's one of he got a degree in chemistry. All right, so all the Americans that went up in the few missions that went up in the 40s, they all met this man. He was sort of the middleman. He was writing to the Americans because they were thinking that Nepal has minerals. And it's very interesting that the first expert that the U.S. government sent to Nepal in 1951 was a geologist. And the Bureau of Mines building near Lazimpot was built, you know, by U.S. aid in the 1960s. So that was the initial interest of America in Nepal was the minerals. All right, next. All right, this man is named Harry Witt, and he was from Houston, Texas, and he was in New Delhi at the same time, and he was the boss of Corey. So he went up in September of 1945, and the Nepal government asked him if the U.S. would help industrialize Nepal and help Nepal engage in world trade. So he met with Prime Minister Juda, Commander-in-Chief Mohan Shamsher, and Mohan Shamsher's son Bijay Shamsher, who was the head of the chairman of the Nepal's Development Board. And Witt made a 1-month trek from Nuwakot across to Arugat and Lumjung and Pokhara, and then down to Tansen and Butol. And the British ambassador, when he heard of this, he was furious because the British had been there for years and years, and you know they were not allowed to travel outside Kathmandu Valley. And they said, why is the American allowed to do this? All right, now why is the Nepal government looking to America in 1945? All right, first of all, you know, Britain had been bombed and was in the Second World War, and Britain was going to leave India. They knew that. Secondly, you know, Nepal had been trading with Japan. They'd been getting textiles from Japan. Well, Japan was bombed and leveled, and Germany was leveled. So the only superpower and the most technologically advanced country in 1945 was the U.S. And that's why the Ranas were saying, you know, if we want to develop to some extent, you know, we need to work with the Americans. All right,
so who is this guy?
This is Harry Witt, and his daughter lives in Tempe, Arizona. And doing this research, I found her and I called her. She's about a little bit younger. She's never been to Nepal, but she's very interested in her father. And she sent me this photo. This photo was taken in Delhi, not in Nepal. But he took a video. She sent me a video. Next time we meet.
What year is this?
45. And he took a video here in Nepal, 1945. It's not very good quality, but anyway, how many videos were taken in Nepal in 1945? All right, next. All right, this is Bijay Shamsher. So he's the son of Mohan Shamsher, you know, who was the last Rana prime minister. And he was very well educated, and he spoke very good English. And all the Americans that went up to Nepal, you know, met him and were very impressed with this man. His son is Pashupati Shamsher. You know, Pashupati Shamsher is 80 years old, and you know, I met him. I wanted him to write a foreword to this book, but it didn't happen. Anyway. All right, so Bijay Shamsher, he gave to that Witt a list of 15 projects that the Nepal government wanted to develop: a sugar mill, a leather factory, etc., etc. I know that this list has never been published before, even in Nepali. The records may be in Nepal, but where are they, right? I've been in the archives. It's very hard to find things and so on. In any case, now what happened to him? He was electrocuted in Delhi in 1953 as a very young man in a bathtub. And somebody told me that the Indians actually, you know, I hate to have this on tape. Anyway, there's, you know, like like Birendra, who killed Birendra? There are all these conspiracy theories, just like who killed Kennedy. So there's a conspiracy theory that he was murdered by the Indians because he had a thing for Indira Gandhi. Now I don't know if that's true or not, but that's a story I heard. All right, next. All right, so now George Merrill was an ex-American to go up to Nepal, and he was the highest-ranking U.S. diplomat in India, and he met Padma Shamsher. Here's Padma Shamsher in November 1945, and they negotiated an agreement of commerce and friendship with Nepal. So again, he wrote a report of what he was told, what Nepal was thinking, and what they saw in Kathmandu. And some of that, not the entire report, because this book would be like this if I put in all the records. But I took out sections of his report and put it in this book. Thanks. Now here's Joseph Satterthwaite. Now President Truman appointed him to go to Nepal and lead a delegation to negotiate an agreement that established official diplomatic relations between Nepal and the United States. This agreement was signed April 25th, 1947, 75 years ago. And so this is the 75th year. So America was the second country to have diplomatic relations with Nepal because India was not independent yet. So of course they had diplomatic relations with England, and America was the second country. But again, there was no embassy, no American embassy until 1959.
After democracy.
All right, so all right, this is King Tribhuvan as a young man. Now, so the Americans that went up there, Tribhuvan was the head of state. But as all the Nepalis here know, but maybe you know, the king had no power. He was a ceremonial figure, but he was head of state, right? So he was respected and so on. But he was not allowed to go out and meet the Nepalis and so on. He hadn't even been outside of Nepal until about 1944, I think. So because the Ranas, so they kept a close watch on him. However, he was in touch with Nepalis in India, that were plotting to overthrow the Ranas. All right, so there's a lot of information too about the Nepali Congress. They started in 1947. These were Nepalis who'd been exiled to India. They studied in India. Some of them, were like B.P. Karala was a socialist and so on. And so they were working with him secretly to overthrow the Ranas. All right. Yes. Ganesh thing. All right. So this man too he was arrested by the Ranas at 39, and then he escaped from jail and he went to India, and so he was with the Kordas and so on. So he was a leader of the forces to overthrow the Ranas, and he actually lived until 1997 and played a role in the 1989-1990 Janta Andolan, the movement where King Birendra had to give up a lot of his powers to the Democratic.
He was in my house too.
Yeah. Oh, he was in your house?
Yeah, B.P. Koirala, he was all the
Back
way
in
that keeps
90,
it
when
up.
was it?
This-
I'm sorry, when I was Peace Corps doing my research, I never thought to, the interview.
They stayed here, I wrote the letter to President Carter,
All right,
79.
So, all right.
Okay.
we're moving on. All right, now here's Kesa Shamsher. Now he's the son of Chandra Shamsher, and now this is his second wife. Probably about 30, 40 years younger, and that's his daughter. And that woman, that girl, is still living in Kathmandu. There are only two people in this book that are still alive. One is this woman, and one is King Gyanendra. And I'll show him in a minute. So Kesa Shamsher, he had many. He was a general when he was 15. I mean, all the Ranas, the Shamsher Ranas were given the rank of general. Kesa Shamsher, and he had the largest collection of books, maybe in Asia, certainly in Nepal, the Kesa Library.
Yeah.
And that library was severely damaged in the 2015 earthquake, and they're supposedly reconstructing it and so on. And the Garden of Dreams, is open for that. You can go in there. That's part of the Kesa Library complex. So he at this time he was ambassador to the UK, and he was minister to Nepal. So he came to America in 1948 and gave his credentials to President Truman. All right, here's Henry Grady, and he was U.S. ambassador to India and minister to Nepal. See, they were ministers to Nepal because they didn't have an embassy. And he met Mohan Shamsher in May of 1948. And again, the people that went with him, they wrote reports about what they saw and what they were told. And they said that the dominant fact about Nepal was its isolation. So any general U.S. State Department involvement in Nepal would be premature. And of course, the U.S. government had no foreign aid program in 1948. You know, the Marshall Plan was to help rebuild Germany. That was sort of a special program. The first foreign aid program was really started in 1951. And Nepal, it was like $50,000 for Nepal. It was very minor. You know, the foreign aid really did not begin to grow in Nepal until about 1955. So the Ranas were asking, you know, for U.S. help, but we didn't have a foreign aid program. And there were three main reasons, too, why nothing happened during the Rana, even though they had these plans, which most people in Nepal don't know, or, you know, they have this view of the Ranas were exploiters and oppressors and so on, which they were, but by the 1940s, the younger Ranas, like Vijay Shamsher, they had the idea that Nepal has to change, right? And we have to slowly do some development. But so one problem was Nepal had almost no foreign exchange. At that time, they were part of the sterling area. And they had to get they had a little bit of sterling, but they had to get it from the British in India, and later the Indians. And the Indians themselves didn't have much sterling. So how were they going to buy the U.S. equipment that they wanted? The second problem was all that equipment would have to come either through Bombay or Calcutta, which again was controlled either by the British in India or later by independent India. And if they didn't want that equipment to go to Nepal, they could have stopped it. So the U.S. government was telling Nepal, you have to get some kind of an agreement with India before we could really do trade, because India's, you know, India controls you in many ways. Then the third thing, of course, was Mohan Shamsher was a very conservative man. The Congress Party was agitating in India, and of course, by this time, I don't think he was really interested in some of these development projects. He was worried about, you know, keeping his power. Now in 1948, Loy Henderson, there's a State Department room that's called the Loy Henderson Room here in Washington. And he went to Kathmandu on an official mission in December 48. See, and one of the men with him, you know, took this photo. Now the reports that he sent, I did not find 25 years ago. They may have been in that box that was missing, or anyway. But you see some pictures. These pictures came from Georgetown University. So here they're coming up to this is the palace. This is the palace in Basantapur, Hanumandoka Palace, not Singadorbar. And there's a called Gaddi Bertak. Is that the right pronunciation? That was open. Now before I could never go there, but now you can go in and see this hallway.
Yeah, I have never.
Yeah, well they just opened it recently. So here's Loy Henderson coming up. All right.
Wow.
Okay, then now the next one. So here's the hallway, and there's King Truman up on the throne. And there's Mohan Shamsher is here, and Loy Henderson, you know, Loy Henderson is here. And these are all the Ranas here, a lot of them.
Beautiful.
Here's this is probably Jungabhadur. Here's King Truman. Here's my guess is Queen Victoria. And they had, you know, these big paintings all down the hall. Now they're not there. They removed most of them. Here's King Mahendra. You see, he's on the throne.
Chandelier, so nice.
Next. So this room now you can see, but of course you can't go inside. All right, next. All right, now see, Loy Henderson is reading a speech, but who's he reading it to? He's reading to the king. But here, and so here's Mohan Shamsher, you know, listening. But again, the king was. All right, next I'll show you the next picture. So after his speech, you see, he's introducing his delegation, the Americans, to the king, and they probably shook hands and whatever, but they didn't engage in any kind of substantive talks because the king wasn't allowed to do that. You know, everything went through the Ranas. And here's King Mahendra.
Yeah.
See, here's King Mahendra. Here's Mohan Shamsher, and here's King Trubot. I'm not sure. This might be Babur Shamsher. I'm not sure. All right, next. All right. Now we go to Dillon Ripley. Have any of you heard of Dillon Ripley? Dillon Ripley was a zoologist with Yale University and also part of the Smithsonian Institution. And in 1947, he got permission to go into Nepal and hunt birds. And some of these birds are probably still on display at the Smithsonian. I haven't looked recently. All right, next. Now, of course, Dillon Ripley didn't know Nepali, where to go on the Terai, so here was his guide. Now, just like the mountaineering people hire the Sherpas, right? So this man, I mean, unfortunately his feet are cut off, but he has no shoes. He has a kukri, he has an old British rifle, right? But he knows where to go through the jungle, right? And so he guided Dillon Ripley through the jungle. All right, next. And this was a book, and again, this is on Amazon for like $10. You know, it's been reprinted. This was published in 1952. And he kept a diary, you know, and he talks about Western Nepal. The people there had no idea of, you know, that's a modern world, you know. A lot of them went to India during the winter, but Nepal was Kathmandu, you know, I'm going to Nepal, I met Kathmandu. So the political consciousness was not there. Even though the Congress Party says, oh, Nepal is ready to uprise, and that, people in the villages, you know, they weren't politically informed at all. You know, there were no communications. There were very few roads. All right, next. All right, this man is Dr. Carl Taylor, and he was born in India, and he conducted the first health survey in Nepal in 1949. And again, he went from Bhutol, and he went north through all the way up to Jomson or Pokhara. And he made a record of all the diseases that he saw, and there's a lot of them in here. And it's amazing that 75 years ago, the kind of illnesses and the kind of diseases that were prevalent in Nepal, because there were almost no hospitals, very little medicine, and so on. And of course, people came and wanted him to treat them, and he did conduct certain surgeries, like for hair, lip, and for eyes, and so on. But he didn't go there really to do surgery, but you know, to do this health survey. And later, he became, you know, a world famous expert at Johns Hopkins University on international health. Obviously, this picture was taken, you know, much later.
Months later.
Next. All right, who's this?
I don't know.
You don't know? Oh my goodness. No, this is Subarna Shamsher. Now, Subarna Shamsher, you know, by 1949, again, the movement among the Nepalis in Banaras and Calcutta was growing, you know, to overthrow the Ranas. Now, and a lot of the Ranas had been exiled to India. Well, why was that? Because the men, you know, they not only married a proper wife, but they had mistresses. And so there were hundreds, they were very prolific, the Ranas. And so they divided the Ranas, they call them the A class and the C class. The A class were the offspring of women who had been married according to Hindu ceremonies and so on. But the mistresses, they were the C Ranas, right? And so by 1932, they were all these, and they had a role of succession, you know. So I won't go into all that. But anyways, Judah Shamsher purged the C Ranas off the role of succession, and many of them were exiled to India. So Subarna Shamsher really was in Calcutta, and he's a very rich businessman. And he gave a lot of money to Corrals and the others, you know, to overthrow. Wait, we're not there yet. But the point is that after the Ranas fell, he came back to Nepal as a finance minister. And then in 1959, when there was an elected, when Corral was elected prime minister, he became again a minister. But then 1960, Mahendra arrested, you know, dismissed the Congress Party, and so Subarna again went to Calcutta where he died. He never went back to Nepal. Next. All right, now that's K.I. Singh. I mentioned a little bit about him. He was another leader of the Ranas in western Nepal, and when there was an agreement in 1950 to lay down their arms, he refused. He kept fighting. So the Indians had to send in a part of the army to arrest him, and he was taken to Kathmandu and put in jail. And then he escaped from jail, and he went to Tibet. And then he went to China and met Mao Zedong. He was in China for, I don't know, 5, 6 years. Then he came back. He was considered a great hero in Nepal. And then King Mahendra actually made him prime minister. So he was a very strange man. I don't know his ideology, what he really believed. Anyway, very interesting life. K.I. Singh, right next.
Yeah, he was a medical doctor. Right?
Well, he was but not a. He wasn't a medical doctor like we have here, homeopathic or something.
Oh.
His credentials are
Ayurvedic or something.
He called himself a doctor, but that's another story.
Okay.
All right, now here in 1950, you know, in November, the king went out of the embassy. Went out of his palace and sought refuge in the Indian embassy with most of his family. And Mohan Shamsher said, you know, you have to come back. Why did you do this? Well, the king didn't go back, and so Mohan Shamsher crowned the grandson, king. This is Gyanendra. 3 years old. He became the king in November of 1950. And so then the Indians flew Tribhuvan and the family to Delhi. So King Gyanendra is unique in world history. He's the only man that has been king twice. 1950 for a short time, and then in 2001 after Birendra was assassinated. So here he is, and they put out coins and so on. But none of the foreigners, none of the foreign governments would recognize Gyanendra. You know, the American.
Who is this guy here? The mustache?
That's Mullen Shumsher.
Oh,
Mullen
it's
So
Shumsher.
he's the one that said that we're going to crown Ganendra because Tribune has left the crown.
Right.
Tribune has gone.
Gone to India.
That's
Well,
why
he was still in Nepal, but he refused to come back to the palace. So anyway, so where are we now? So this was the start of the revolution in Nepal, and then the Congress Party came up, Birgunj, Bidratnagar, but there was no way they were going to take over Nepal, right? They couldn't have defeated the Ranas. But what happened was, so when Tribune went to India, then Nehru got involved, and Nehru was really the broker. And again, this comes out very clearly, that because again, the Americans were, we had an embassy there, Britain had an embassy, but the Indians were the big, were the big brother, right, close to Nepal. So Nehru was the one that really organized the interim government that they had, right there. So there's Nehru. And that's his sister. His wife apparently died at a younger age. And that's Lloyd Henderson. And you see, what's interesting in here is that Nehru's advisors and so on were telling the Americans what Nehru's thinking, what the Indians are thinking, you see. And those records, as I say, those records in India have never been made public, and we don't have records, in Nepal. But so, again, this is just a partial view. And it's sort of secondhand, but there's some information here that shows very clearly, that India was playing a very important role in, managing things in Nepal. And of course, after Tribune went back in February of 1951, the Indians sent advisors up there. They sent a military mission up there because Nehru said the border of Nepal is vital to the defense of India. And so I don't believe that India wanted to take over Nepal. Some in Nepal say, oh, well, India wanted to annex Nepal. I don't believe that. But they were not, and remember the Chinese, and it's in here, the Chinese marched into Lhasa in 1950 at the same time. So Nehru was worried about the Chinese, the Nepalis were worried about the Chinese, and America became worried about the Chinese. Would they go into Nepal, would they go into India? All right, next. All right, so here's February 1951. On the left is the Indian ambassador, C.P.N. Sinha to Nepal, King Tribune, and Mullen Shumsher. And Tribune is going to get on a plane and go back to Nepal February the 15th. And when we were there, that was considered Democracy Day in Nepal. Now, was it democracy? Well, it was, the Ranas, here again, it was a strange revolution because King Tribune was king before, and after the revolution, he was still king.
Yeah.
And Mullen Shumsher was the prime minister before, and he was prime minister after. So, was it a revolution or not? Anyway, so this, and then, okay, next. Yeah. All right, so here's Mullen Shumsher on the left, and there's the king, King Tribune, and here's B.P. Korala.
Oh my God.
How young?
Now, B.P. Korala is considered in many ways like the George Washington of Nepal. And there's no question, he was a central figure. But he was only minister for about 10 months in 1951. And then he left. And then the Congress Party split. And, there was a lot of opposition to B.P. Korala. And it's here in this book. There were other Nepalis who didn't agree with what he wanted to do, didn't like what he wanted to do, and so on. Now it's all that's been pushed under the rug. And again, he was a great figure. I'm not denying that at all. But there's a lot of reports in here saying that and the main thing was the Congress Party split, and that has happened the last 70 years, right? The Communist Party splits, the Congress splits. That's one of the main problems in Nepal with politics, is that there's not a unified opposition. And the Congress Party was split in 1950. All right, next. All right, here's Chester Bowles. He was ambassador at 52. Now, this was before the Tribune Rajpath was built. That was 56. There was no road to Kathmandu until 1956. So he's riding a horse over the old trail, which is what you had to do to go to Kathmandu. Now, he could have taken a plane to Kathmandu. My guess he wanted to show his machismo, right? But anyway, so this is how all these people before 1950, how you got to Nepal, is you had to, you could take the railway and then you had to walk.
You have to carry and all this thing.
All right, so in other words, the book then has excerpts of State Department cables and reports. It gives an inside view of the Americans' perspective of the situation in Nepal, the challenges the country faced, and some of the players, the Nepalis, the Indians, the British, the Americans, who all had a role in the political and economic issues of that time. So this is the raw material of history. And people will read it and come to different conclusions, but that's the facts of history, you see. But there's a lot of information in here that's never been published, and that I know a lot of Nepalis
Can we get one?
will
Can we
be
buy one?
interested. So it's available here for $15, right?
I got one.
All right.
I'll
But
give
to
you
use it.
And so I. Zoo, do we have to quit?
No,
Okay.
We have a quit in 10 minutes.
All right. So anyway, that's enough. And thank you for